It's no longer okay to say, I'm just buying it from Vietnam. As far as I'm concerned, I tell my supplier, I don't want anything from forced labor, and they sign yes, they're not going to send me anything for forced labor, and so I'm just taking that for granted.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, welcome back to another show with of Simply Trade. We are so excited the way our show has been trending up, and it's all to your listenership. And thank you for sharing our show and liking us in the comments and all. In particular, I hope that y'all will reach out to us on LinkedIn. There's other social media and stuff. I'm not that astute to know which one we should be doing. But anyway, Lalo will be able to talk on that. You know me, I'm dumb as a box of rocks here. But thank you for your support. And with that, Lalo, I'm telling you, it's, we're definitely heading into the heat of summer, if you will, and across the country. And there's all kinds of things happening, but, we're in triple digits in many parts of the country, yours and mine both, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And then our guests will say the same thing. But yeah, here in El Paso, I think it's our 18th day of triple digits in a row. So yeah, it's been hot. But anyway, I guess at this point, at my age, I can't really complain too much because I already had 50 plus years of this living here. So, it's the same thing every year after year. But yeah, I mean, it is warm right now. So, but better than it's being cold. I don't like it to be cold. So,
well, I will say we are going to be doing a follow up. So it'll be kind of a hot topic anyway. So it kind of fits in line with that. We have a returning guest who is just so well respected. It is such a pleasure to always get to talk to. And I've worked on this, Anna, and if I bastardize it again, I ask you to forgive me right now. Anna Hinojosa. Is that right? Is that close?
Hinojosa.
I don't know. Hinojosa. I don't know why I have such a hard time.
Hinojosa. You can do it. You can do it.
Okay.
I'm
gonna get. Listen, it's like, and Mara, our producer in the background here, is just dying because she was hoping for me to screw this up so she can get the outtakes. So, all right, there you go. I don't know why I have such a hard time, and forgive me because it's like you are such a caliber of person that is just so internationally recognized. You are so well respected and all that. And here I'd screw up a 2-car parade on this. So my apologies.
No.
And it's really interesting, Anna, because we've had guests come on our show and they reference you, believe it or not. So yeah, I mean, your reputation is really well, and you're respected in the community. So it's really cool to tell people and name drop and say, yeah, she's been on our show.
Well, that's really nice.
Really
for me, it's great to be able to be on the show with you guys. I love your format. It's relaxing. It's down to earth and really I think makes it more entertaining to watch because you're not having a very like kind of a rigid presentation. So who knows what's going to happen on our conversation today? Who knows? It's exciting.
Who knows? Who knows where we're going with this? Yeah. So I had a pleasure of also having breakfast, almost brunch with Anna recently here in El Paso. She was here for a security conference. It was on all types of security, border security, cybersecurity, all that kind of stuff. So it was nice meeting up with you in person. But today's show will be on forced labor, and I do want to let the audience know this is going to be a special series. So we're really excited. We're kicking it off with Anna, maybe something else in the government, but we're also going to record another show on also on forced labor, but with relations to like attorneys or service providers that help clients, and which Anna does too, by the way, but help clients mitigate or even defend if they get flagged for inspection. And then we'll also have the technology piece. So we're going to spread it out over 3, 4, maybe even 5 shows, because we're hoping to get Mexican counterparts talking about the forced labor, someone in Mexico, be it from the government or attorneys or someone who practices there. And then also the Canadian piece, because all 3 in North America have recently implemented, not recently, the US was first, but the other 2 have also implemented measures for that. But we're really excited, and Anna is kicking this off for us. And well, I'm really glad to have you here on the show again, Anna.
Thank you, Lalo. Thank you, Andy, again for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our session today. Where would you like to start?
Well, since we've talked, all right, folks, we're talking about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that has been talked about and talked about and talked about. It's coming, it's then implemented, and here we go. And there's been all kinds of different issues. We know that Canada has implemented a forced labor prevention legislation, and it's taken effect, as well as Mexico. So at least North America is covered in this, and quite frankly, I believe it is having a really hard effect on China, if you will, and some of that their products. But let's just back up a minute. People know it's a big deal. What seems to be the latest trend right now, or with what you've seen? Has there been any surprises, or is it playing out as far as enforcing the forced labor prevention? Is it playing out the way you had envisioned in what you were looking at there, Anna?
So I think, thanks for the question, Andy. I think it's important to note that, as you were mentioning, that Canada passed a forced labor act, and Mexico has now, passed or has published a regulation that talks about the prohibition of importation of goods produced with forced labor. Both Canada and Mexico have an obligation as part of the U.S.-Canada-North American U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement. They have an obligation as parties that are signatories to that agreement to implement those laws, and so they've kind of passed the laws. I think both Mexico and Canada are having to do some additional work to actually figure out the full implementation of what that's going to mean. Canada has a different regulatory structure as to who has authority to do what, and how that law was written requires involvement of other government agencies beyond Canada Border Services. So that means a little bit more complication, a little bit more procedures for them to be able to work through in order to fully be able to start doing some border enforcement for that. And Mexico, I think Mexico is going to find that they have similar challenges, in that the way the Mexican law works, they need they're going to, it's, the devil's going to be in the details on how they can actually start implementing it. It's good that they've published it and that they have, I guess, maybe indicated an interest in having that law in place. A lot more details to be seen yet from the Mexican government on how the actual on the ground implementation or border enforcement will happen with regards to that. But your question was about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and how it's going. What do I think? So I am going to say, just to, like, for the listeners who maybe are less aware of what the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is about and what the difference is. So the U.S. has a forced labor law that prohibits the importation of goods produced with forced labor. The regular law is codified in Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930. That's a little just like homework academic stuff for folks that like to get into that stuff. And that's the normal forced labor enforcement. It applies to all over the world, and And barring any special laws, that would be the law and the procedures that the U.S. CBP in particular would use to prohibit goods from being able to come into the U.S. if there's a suspicion that they may be produced with forced labor. But as you very well noted, at the end of 21, Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and it had an implementation date of June of 22. And so it kicked off in June of 22. I think the private sector was up in arms because they really weren't sure how it was going to be implemented and what kind of a devastating impact it would have on the economy. I think CBP, true to its history and its MO or method of operations, has done a yeoman's job of trying to provide clarity to the private sector about what was going to be expected. There were obligations with the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act on the department, on DHS, and on CBP for publishing additional information to try to help the private sector be in a better position to comply. I think, again, for the listeners who aren't quite following this as closely, the big difference is that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act applies to materials and goods that have some sort of a connection to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. The goods don't have to be coming from China, but the materials that go into those goods need to have a connection to that region of China. And there's also provisions for companies that have been listed as potential entity on the entities list, and other information that the government may have about where there have been forced labor transfer programs where the Chinese Communist Party has basically forcefully taken people from Xinjiang into other regions of China to, still under forced labor conditions, put them to work on manufacturing products that ultimately make it to other markets, including the United States market. So the rule or the law imposes a presumption of forced labor on any goods that contain materials that are connected to the Xinjiang region. And when a shipment is detained, the importer of record now must rebut that presumption. So some of it is legal terms on what kind of who has the authority to prove what in the case of detentions. And so because of the way the law was passed, if a shipment is detained by Customs and Border Protection, that shipment is presumed to be violative or presumed to have been produced with forced labor, unless that importer can demonstrate either that those goods don't in fact have any connection to Xinjiang, or if they do have a connection to Xinjiang, through clear and convincing evidence that those goods were not manufactured with forced labor. A much, much higher bar to reach. But yeah, so I kind of have been talking for a while. I can keep going on what how I think the enforcement is, but I would like for you guys to chime in a little bit more if I've gone into too much detail.
No. Actually, you were hitting on some really good stuff. But one of the things that I was picking up on and I wanted to ask is the government producing a list? And you covered it so fast, I'm kind of slow on the uptick here. So you may have to repeat yourself here. Is the government producing a list or publication that says, hey, here are companies that are guilty of an infraction using forced labor, or here's where this region is coming from, or whatever the case is? Is there a resource that somebody should be looking for there to say, hey, as I'm looking at my vendors or whatever, let me double check to see if they're on this list or not? For sure.
Yes. The government, and again, kudos to my former colleagues at CBP and DHS. They have in fact published an entities list. I think when you talk to people on the private side, from the private sector, it's not a detailed enough list for them, because they'll say, well, how can CBP be detaining goods from this company when this company wasn't on the list, right? So the list is a list of companies that CBP has sufficient information to put on a list, where there's either been it's not all inclusive, and clearly when CBP has a site on their webpage that is specifically for Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and they've really published a lot of information on there. It's very useful. They have now created and published a dashboard which keeps track of the enforcement actions. Again, the private sector would love for CBP to specifically list which shipments have been detained and what importers were detained and the classification of the products that were detained. But obviously, that's not something that the government is prepared to do, and neither would a private sector entity whose shipment gets detained. Would they want that information to be released? So yes, the government has published a list. It is a list that you should definitely steer clear from. But it's not the only thing that you need to look at when considering whether yeah.
Well, all right. So, Lalo, we'll see if we can't look to see, put a link to that in our show notes and we'll double check with you as whatever we're coming up with. So, folks, look at the show notes so you can, get more resources. If you are in the purchasing area, the sourcing area, supply chain area and things of that nature, folks, you need to really be looking at this kind of stuff, because it's just stop and think for a second. You go through, you source a product, it's manufactured, it is shipped, you get everything going, you can go all the way through that, it lands at the port, and CBP looks at it, goes, oh, can't let it in. Nope, it can't work. Are you going to be able to explain to your upper management why your group did not do the appropriate checks and balances to find out who you're dealing with and where the goods are coming from? I'm telling you, I do know that there have been several folks losing their job because of, things getting, stopped, seized, and or returned or destroyed, for that matter. And it's just all because somebody didn't do their due diligence.
Yeah, and I mean, more and more, Andy, consumers are very focused on the practices of the companies they're buying and the brands that they're buying. I mean, I think you've seen some of the impacts on some brands based on who's endorsing them, who's not endorsing them, and certainly as information gets out about certain brands not having strong environmental, social, or governance practices in place, that really turns off a lot of consumers. And having a shipment detained because of forced labor is something that can have some huge reputational impact on the brands.
Well, one of the things too, we talk so much about China and the Uyghur region, that northwest region of China. There's other locations that, come into play that have forced labor. I mean, it could be Indonesia, it could be Turkey, it could be UAE, believe it or not, and just other places. So in that, have you seen, we put so much focus on China, and that's the hot button, I get it. Have you seen or heard of enforcement activities of goods coming from other parts of the world that the Forced Labor Act is kicking in here on enforcement?
So, I mean, certainly the withhold release orders that were already in place before the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act are still in effect. Those that were specific to the Xinjiang region have been subsumed by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which means they now have that higher standard to meet. But CBP is still taking enforcement action and working with the companies that have those withhold release orders to get them to remediate and see if their withhold release orders can be lifted. I am confident that the non-governmental and civil society groups continue to send in allegations to CBP for their investigation. And as CBP is able to establish reasonable suspicion of forced labor, we will be seeing some more withhold release orders coming out for other parts of the world. There was a time where Malaysia there were a lot of allegations of forced labor in Malaysia, and there's still a number of withhold release orders in place for Malaysia. And there was some efforts on the part of some of the large companies to fix their issues, and the government has sort of indicated that they were going to try to make changes to their government on how they recruited and drew migrant workers into the country for all of these manufacturing jobs. And so there was kind of a glimmer of hope that things were getting better. But in fact, I'm hearing that things are now getting worse again in Malaysia. So I wouldn't be surprised if Malaysia itself started to see more areas of concern, just because there is more publicity about the poor handling of migrant workers going into Malaysia. And I think that's an issue too in other countries. You mentioned some of the UAE countries. A lot of the labor is migrant labor. Much of that labor goes into domestic service or domestic consumption, I'll call it that. So where the U.S. would have any kind of enforcement capability would only be as it related to the manufacture of any goods that are then sent to the U.S. market. And so that's why we haven't seen a whole lot coming out of the UAE with regards to enforcement, but certainly I'm sure allegations will be coming forward to the government and they will investigate it.
With that, I will say that we had talked about this. I think it may have been on your no, I don't think it was on your show. It was on a follow-up, because I guess a year after the act took effect, there was a look at, and I think it was like $1 billion worth of goods had been seized at the ports. And of that, I believe there was only like 80 million that came directly from China. There was like $400 million or 450 million that came from Malaysia, and another 350 million that came out of Vietnam with components that were produced initially from the Uyghur region and then shipped there. And there was a substantial transformation of the raw goods into something else, but then they still got stopped. So that's, to your point, the goods are still flowing down. The manufacturing does not have to itself be from direct forced labor situations. The components, the raw goods may have been, and then they're putting it in there. So it's kind of a tough scenario there. You've got to really track this down from a supply chain perspective.
Yeah, I think Andy, you bring up a really good point, because when I talk to people, for some reason, people think or believe, because of maybe they're looking at what's currently being targeted or what was initially being targeted by CBP, that, that's only going to apply to wearing apparel or cotton wearing apparel or cotton goods. And then, maybe some polysilicon and maybe some solar stuff. And then now that the CBP is publishing the dashboard, which even if you just use the search engine for UFLPA dashboard, you'll be able to get to the CBP's dashboard. There, you're able to see that the detentions are broader than just the 3 priority areas that had been listed in the law and on some of the marketing materials. Originally, it was tomatoes, polysilicon, and cotton were priority areas. But the reality is that anything connected to Xinjiang, any product, if it can be connected by the government to Xinjiang, should be detained by CBP, because according to the way the law is written, it is presumed to be produced with forced labor. Obviously, CBP uses a risk management system so that it can manage addressing those areas where they find the highest risk. But I think we're starting to see some diversification of products that are being detained, and that will only continue.
So here's a question that I'm a compliance manager, director, whatever, of a company. We're importing goods in. I'm thinking that we have sufficient, we'll say, layers between us and the raw goods that if there's a problem, it's going to be my distributor's issue, or I'm going to go back onto that, which in fact, in the way this new law is written, I'm the one that's the actual importer. My company is the importer. They're the ones going to be ultimately held responsible regardless of all this. So we're looking at that. So now that I'm looking at it, my company has been using, let's say, sources in China or other Far East countries. What should I be looking at? What would be your recommendation to go? Should I be doing some checks on certain things as a compliance person before I start going up the chain? Do I need to look at it and go, an aha moment going, oh, great, look what I just discovered kind of thing? What would you recommend me to do to say, Andy, you ought to check out X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, so I think, obviously the size of the company will help dictate how much bandwidth you have as an employee in a compliance department. And I say that because, the more imports, the more risk, right? And so I would what the government has said, and it's what I would recommend as well. It's no longer okay to say I'm just buying it from Vietnam. As far as I'm concerned, I tell my supplier I don't want anything from forced labor, and they signed yes, they're not going to send me anything for forced labor, and so I'm just taking that for granted.
Trust us.
Yeah. Unacceptable. Not sufficient due diligence or a reasonable care in with the level of risk for this particular regulatory space. The government has been very clear that importers, since the MOD Act of 1993, are required to exercise reasonable care to ensure that the foreign goods that they present to the U.S. are compliant with all laws, rules, and regulations, and that includes the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so it's important to have transparency on the supply chain. So you say, well, how am I going to know? Well, you're going to have to figure it out. And there's different ways of doing that, right? So as you're looking to contract with suppliers, you need to be clear to have a clear supplier code of conduct and clear understanding from your supplier that they should be obligated to give you at least the names of the companies that they're doing business with, because that's the only way that you as the importer can comply with the U.S. government's requirements. And as you determine where the various raw materials come from, you should be checking. Now, some companies that have, there's a number of technology solution providers out there who are doing an amazing job of gaining transparency into where the Chinese Communist Party has ownership or beneficial ownership into companies, or connections for companies that are listed to other companies who have now new names. Because part of the, I'm going to digress a little bit, but part of the reason why when I was with the government, we really didn't want to publish a list is because once you publish a list, those entities will immediately change their name. And so you're never going to see those goods coming in from those listed names, because once their name has appeared on a government list, it's no longer that name anymore. And so, to some extent, it becomes a moot issue. But having supply chain transparency, super important. Taking a look at who those supply chain actors are, either through search engine checks. Ideally, you have the services of some sort of supply chain transparency tool that actually has more, yellow flags, red flags about about where there may be connections of ownership to listed entities. And it's important because one of the listed entities is the Xinjiang Construction and Xinjiang Production and Construction, XPCC, Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. And they're actually the military arm of the Chinese Communist Party. And they have thousands upon thousands of subsidiaries and interest into many companies. And so if those are excluded, then it's important for a company in the US to know whether they are anywhere in their supply chain, because the risk of those goods being detained is very high.
Well, with that, let's pull it back around, because we talked about a lot of things that are, if you're very astute in the compliance arena, you can pick up on some of it, but it's still kind of, no disrespect, but it's kind of like pie in the sky kind of thoughts. I want to bring it down to a little bit more. Let me sink my teeth into this. So I'm going to offer this suggestion, and you tell me if this would be a good thing or not. Again, I'm a compliance person. I'm looking at this. If you are importing some significant product, it could be 10% of your overall product, but if that 10% comes back and is hung up and gives a negative connotation to your brand, you're in trouble across the board, right? But, it could be 20%, 50%, it doesn't matter. I would think that I'm like, okay, I still am confused on where I should go if I'm a key compliance director or whatever. Would it be wise for me to at least reach out to somebody like yourself or some kind of Uyghur forced labor, consultant type person, an expert, to come in and spend a little bit of time and literally just put a game plan together? Is one offer. The other is in some of that, as you're beginning to, I guess, come up with some things and you start checking things out. I'm sitting here thinking I would probably want to go and see. People have done their due diligence. Now I'm wanting to literally see for myself. I'm going to book a trip and go see some of these things, but I need to take an expert with me so that if I'm looking at something, I'm like, is this good? Is this bad or whatever? So there's two proposals there. One, somebody come in, give you a game plan and help plan that out to say, what should I do? And it may take you a year to pull all that off. And two, I'm ready to go see for myself of what work has been done. And should I take somebody with me that knows what they're doing to be able to go over and say, yes, this is a good thing or not?
So, I think, Andy, you bring up a couple of interesting points, and the answer is, it just depends on the size of the company. And I kind of started with that on trying to, because now that I'm on the private side, I realize that not every company has sufficient dedicated resources to really focus on their compliance. One of the things that I would say is the issue of forced labor compliance is so big that it really should have the awareness of the C-suite of whatever business is importing. But there are a lot of mid-sized companies that don't have a lot of resources focused on that. And so they, where do those compliance people start? I think that there are a lot of resources out there. Like yourselves, you're offering advice, you're offering experts that people can learn from, even if you just take away one or two nuggets from our conversation today. Now that compliance person is a little bit more armed with knowledge. There are a number of other seminars, webinars, events that people can learn from. And those are great opportunities to attend. If you invest, $150 to attend a seminar where you're going to have experts that actually know the body of work, and attending is going to give you access to those experts. You can get a lot of free advice. I'm calling it free advice because you can ask your questions. What's going to help you, and there's plenty of consultants, plenty of law firms out there that are offering advice and guidance, and it is widely available. So I would definitely say if you are a compliance person and you're not comfortable with this, read everything that the government has on their website. There's tons of other information available on the internet, because a lot of these folks who are putting themselves out as consultants or law firms specializing in this have published materials. And so that's definitely some free resources to leverage, and attend events where you can actually have your questions answered. If you're working with the brokers are getting a lot of information. And so your broker is a strong resource as well.
And I guess just to put in a plug, since you opened up the door there, Anna, so you'll be at GTEC, which is the NCBFAA Global Trade. Oh my gosh. Education conference. Oh my goodness. So anyway, you'll be there talking about Uyghur and forced labor and everything. And so it's a shameless plug, but not really. I mean, they're partners. So anyway,
well, there is
so
also,
you'll be there.
To your point, Lalo, to your point, this is actually, it's like there are a lot of service providers will be there too that probably need to align with you, because they probably don't have the expertise, and aligning with somebody like yourself would be a smart thing on their part. So check her out. So
we're going to be there the end of July, 1st of June. Of August. So that's when the conference will be in Oklahoma City. But go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's one of those conferences that I was referencing, where your company could pay a few $100s to send you to one of these conferences where you're gaining a substantial amount of knowledge through the presentations that are being offered, but also giving you access to a lot of professionals that you're in person, you can network with, you can establish relationships with, and find out where you can get additional resources in the future. And I hope to see you guys at GTEC. I'm coming by your booth because I heard you're going to have candies or something there. So I make sure you save the chocolate ones for me.
We're actually going to have tequila there, so sorry.
Okay. Twist my arm.
I'm kidding, but anyway.
We're going to have a good time, though. Looking forward to it. It's and this will be some good folks. This will be our first time at GTEC, so looking forward to it. But with that, let me ask this question. We touched on this before, and I'm looking forward to seeing Amy Morgan on a future show here, or folks from her company. But in what you're seeing, have people been utilizing, automation or systems? Have they been implementing systems, or are they trying to do this manual verification of their supply chains? What do you think would be the best way for somebody to go on that realm?
Yeah. So what I have seen is that many companies have realized that this is a pretty massive undertaking, and that they need help, because even if you could get enough people to do this manually, is not the best way to organize yourself to ensure success in this type of regulatory space. So there are a number of technology solution providers. Obviously, Amy Morgan and Altana AI are fabulous. And she was my panel mate the last time I was here, and she's actually going to be my panel mate at GTEC. So they have a great product, and but there are also other solution providers out there that are offering some similar transparency into the supply chains that will help at least flag where there might be risky suppliers that as an importer, it would be important to mitigate that risk, whichever way that may be, whether that's remediating the supplier and making them come into compliance, or if that's removing the supplier from your supply chain. Also, it's important that once you know who's in your supply chain and what you think you're buying from them, that you have a method to verify that the information that they're giving you is actually accurate. As you probably know, I work with a company that does forensic origin verification, and that is a really good way of having some objective evidence to demonstrate that you are exercising due diligence, because you're not just collecting papers from your suppliers, you're actually taking steps to verify that the information that they're giving you is valid through some sort of an objective methodology. You can either have third-party audits, and you were in, Andy, I'm just getting back to your question before. The third-party audits or even company unannounced audits are great when the environment where your manufacturing is taking place is conducive to that. But if the environment is, for example, in Xinjiang or certain other places in China, that may not be as accessible or as doable as you might find in another country or in another geographic area. And so the answer is yes, if you can do it, and can actually go down and verify that the manufacture is actually taking place. More power to you. Some regions of the world are not as accessible.
Well, to your point, and what I was going to say is where you're going down that road again is outstanding. But there's a key point that you just mentioned that I want to emphasize to our listeners. Accepting a signed piece of paper with a declaration that says, there's no forced labor or whatever is not sufficient anymore. And you're going to have to take actions to do some things. Now, that's one thing. The other thing that comes to mind is I have seen this before. And matter of fact, I heard this even with in the NAFTA, trying to get a NAFTA certification to make sure that, all right, they signed off on the NAFTA cert because it's, it does qualify and all that. And, I can't get them to sign off on it or whatever. And they still use the people and they're still going on. Well, if somebody's not willing to let you send in a third-party auditor, or you go yourself to some of these locations, case in point, Xinjiang or somewhere else, and they're like being evasive or restrictive, or they're not giving you anything, you need to back up and be willing to make that choice to say, you know what, we can't use this provider. Now, they may have a great price, but there's a reason for that. And you need to back up and protect yourself in that decision.
Right. And, I think a lot of people, a lot of companies have thought that, well, if the U.S. market wants to shut itself off to our products, then we don't need to worry about it. Or companies have said, well, this type of due diligence is only required for the United States with how strong the U.S. enforcement is. But as you mentioned earlier, Canada and Mexico have also already passed laws, but they're not alone. Australia has a modern slavery act. The UK, the EU, and several of the other European countries and Scandinavian countries have different laws that have already been passed that require due diligence, and that due diligence includes related to forced labor. And so there are obligations for supply chain transparency and verification of those supply chains. And I say verification, that is just having a piece of paper that says that they don't have any forced labor in their production is not sufficient. So having either another way of, yes, trusting, but verifying that what your supplier is telling you is actually accurate.
I'll say that we could keep on with this, but I'm telling you, you have given some really good, more concrete items for people, I think, to think about. Hopefully we're not scaring them half to death, but, folks, if you haven't been doing anything in this, you've heard about the forced labor and all of that, you might be nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. If you're not doing anything, you better jump on it. So I would just tell you that at this point, we're going to have probably some more things. I want to get into more concrete things for another show. But for right now, we've talked about the CBP posting a list. It would be worthwhile to take a look at that. And the scorecard, the
dashboard.
Uyghur dashboard. Thank you. Excuse me. The dashboard is something to take a look at. Looking at it from a standpoint, put together a game plan is what I'm looking at. I'm offering that suggestion, but it's get an expert to help you. Spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of time would be well worth the effort. And it could be done virtually, as you've talked through, or it could be done face to face, whatever. But at least you would have a game plan. You as a C-suite executive that may have logistics, transportation, import-export compliance, all those kinds of things under your umbrella, you better have a game plan of what you need to do and who needs to do what within your organization. An expert would be a good one to offer to give you guidance. And then the next thing would be, at some point, even with all your staff doing everything they need to do, in my opinion, a C-suite person should be looking at it going, let me go verify it for myself, and take somebody with you that knows what they're doing and guide it along and go from there. Is that a pretty good wrap up there, Anna?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it all falls under the bucket of it's not a luxury anymore. You know, being able to be actively engaged in your compliance program is not a luxury. It is a must. Financial risk, reputational risk, very high if you're not paying close attention to this.
All right. Well, Anna, thank you. Lalo, any comments from you before we wrap up for the day?
No, I don't have too much. I mean, I'm learning a lot about this as it goes along, obviously, since I'm not really in this industry so much. I mean, I didn't mean the industry. I mean the actual shipping, you know. So I learn a lot from like Anna and all the other folks that talk about this. And our listeners have been the ones that have been asking, hey, can we get more and more about forced labor? Which is why we decided to create this series. And we're going to bundle it all in and put them all together, and even put out the videos as well. So we're really excited for that. And
folks, you need to, if you have questions, Anna Hinojosa, right. Hopefully I got that right.
Oops, let me do it here. So you can, there you go.
There. I got it right. Okay. She is well worth checking out and following up. What's the name of your company, Anna?
It is ABH Global Trade Consulting. I know it sounds hard, but if you just realize that my initials are ABH, then the rest is just Global Trade Consulting.
Right. And she's based out of Dallas.
But seriously, folks, take a look at some things there. We're going to be having some others in this series that we're going to literally get into the systems and how that translates the specific actions. I want to see concrete stuff so that you can literally take away and go, I can't do everything, but I can at least take one step or two. And hopefully you'll get something from this show. I think that there's sufficient there that you've got actions in there to take. So there we go.
And we hope to see everybody at GTech.
Definitely. Folks, we've had a good day today. It was a great show, and y'all have a wonderful day as you move on to other things.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.